Thanks again to everyone for coming out today. My name is Nick Serpe. I'm senior editor at the Sun magazine. After a really great first panel, excited for this panel as well, with two great panelists. First, we have Clara Mattei, who's associate professor of economics at the New School for Social Research. Her research contributes to the history of capitalism, exploring the critical relation between economic ideas and technocratic policymaking. Her first book came out last year, Capital Order: How Economists Invented Austerity and Paved the Way to Fascism. And she's currently working on a book that reassesses the golden age of capitalism and Keynesianism through the lens of austerity capitalism. To her left, we have Pavlos Yeroulanos, who is a member of Greek Parliament with PASOK and a shadow minister for development. He's also serving as a member of the Municipal Council of the City of Athens. From 2009 to 2012, he served as Minister of Culture and Tourism. He participates actively in international organizations with the mission to reduce travel restrictions and is involved in international activities for the Benaki Museum. And then I think with that, let's start. Clara's going to go first, and then we'll hear from Pavlos.
Thank you. Perfect. Okay. Fantastic. Thank you so much to the organizers, to Stefanos, to Sam, to Kim. Everyone has been wonderful. Okay, so I would like to open the conversation up to the question of how we can think about the future of social democracy without not recognizing how austerity is persistent in contemporary capitalism. Austerity, of course, is all around us, both in the north and in the south of the globe. It takes the forms of interest rate hikes that haven't stopped in more than a year, regressive taxation, cuts in social expenditures, and deregulation of the labor market with privatization. It is actually so endemic that it largely transcends party lines. And of course, we rarely call it by its name. Indeed, it's usually just synonymous with prudent and rational macroeconomic policy and macroeconomic management. So in this 15 minutes here with you, I would like to make a case for the deep link between capitalism and austerity. Austerity is not just a bug of capitalism, it's a very important feature of capitalism. And this is why I believe that it is important right now to shift the conversation from the usual focus on neoliberalism and instead really think about deeply what austerity capitalism means. In order to do this, we really need to break away from the mainstream debate about austerity and denaturalize capitalism while rethinking what the purpose and the logic of austerity is all about. So mainstream debate usually looks at austerity as a tool to manage the capitalist economy. And it's always about looking at whether austerity works or not fundamentally at increasing growth, taking capitalism for granted. The two sides are those who tell us that austerity is, of course, necessary, a technical necessity to actually run the market smoothly, and those who tell us that austerity is actually bad theory, irrational theory that brings about bad policy. Well, this is, in my mind, a false dichotomy because it doesn't really politicize the issue and realize that austerity, A, is neither a technical necessity, a necessary evil, nor a policy mistake. Rather, austerity is a political weapon used to protect capitalism, especially in moments when, and this is obvious, especially in moments when capitalism is under threat by working class mobilization and other forms of social organization that grow in popularity to demand alternative ways to organize production and distribution. So these dynamics are clearly underway as we speak, with the Fed increasing interest rates with the purpose of softening the labor market, meaning, of course, increasing unemployment so that strikes like the ones we're seeing going on right now stop, and so that nominal wages also stop growing. What we see today, though, is even clearer in the dynamic of what austerity is all about. If we look back at what happened 100 years ago, after the Great War, and this has been the focus of my book, The Capital Order, in which you really see that austerity really was a very powerful tool to defeat alternatives to capitalism that were emerging very widely. So after the First World War, of course, we know inflation was mounting very similarly to today. And someone like John Maynard Keynes realized that any economic problem ultimately is a political problem, and inflation was a very good expression of this. And in fact, in his wording, he says inflation will strike at the whole basis of contract and of the capitalist system generally. So inflation as a political problem, because ultimately it dismantles the ideological consent for the system. And in this way, the enormous mobilization that happened after the Great War was all about rethinking how we produce, how we distribute, and calls for economic democracy, which were happening not just in Eastern Europe, but at the heart of the continent, in Britain and Italy. And it's in this scenario, this explosive scenario, that austerity actually emerges as a bulwark, a vital bulwark against this nascent threats of alternatives to capitalism. So what we see in this story of 150 years ago is also that uncomfortable alliances emerge between liberal democratic governments, such as the ones that were ruling Britain in the 1920s, and fascist regimes such as the one of Benito Mussolini, all focused together to implement austerity in order to really defeat alternatives. So the past also is interesting for us right now in order to really grapple with the operation of austerity. Austerity is a trinity of macroeconomic policies that work together in order to shift resources from the many to the few, in order to increase the precarious condition of citizens all around the globe, and thus really kind of foreclose political imagination or capacities to mobilize. We have, of course, industrial austerity, whereby the state directly intervenes to curb the bargaining power of organized labor via privatization, deregulation of the labor market, and of course, weakening of unions. But this industrial austerity was what Mussolini was very good at in the 1920s. And indeed, this is why he got the great applause of all of the liberal technocrats around the globe, because he was very efficiently restabilizing industrial peace via fundamentally killing all forms of workers' mobilization. But industrial austerity doesn't operate alone. It operates thanks also to the help of monetary austerity that takes the form, of course, of increases in interest rates. What we're seeing today was the most powerful tool that the British Treasury and the Bank of England in the 1920s wielded against their own people in order to foster a recession that allowed for unemployment to soar at such rates that killed the bargaining power of workers, and all of these experiments that I've studied in my work. So this is G.D.H. Cole speaking in the 1920s, and he's observing the effect of these hikes in interest rates in the early 1920s by the Bank of England. The big working class offensive had been successfully stalled off, and British capitalism, though threatened with economic adversity, felt itself once more safely in the saddle and well able to cope, both industrially and politically, with any attempt that might still be made from the labor side to unseat it. So clearly, a short-term cost, the recession, for a much more structural gain, which is restabilizing class relations in a way that capital, as the relation of production that allows for economic growth and profits to happen, was maintained intact. And finally, I would like to focus on the third element of austerity, which is fiscal austerity. And it's the one that we usually think about when we think about austerity. And again, I would like to push the conversation further, because usually the definition one gets of austerity is cuts in the budgets and increase in taxes. This is the definition you find everywhere. Now, this definition, if you see, suffers from a typical bias of the economic discipline, which is that of looking at the economy in the aggregate, okay? Rather than focusing, of course, on class and who wins and who loses. So in the aggregate, increasing taxes tells us nothing of who's actually being taxed, right? And so this is why austerity is not about raising taxes, it's about regressive taxation. It's about taxing the working people, so increasing consumer taxation, what we see everywhere today, while you also cut corporate taxes and all taxes on wealth. Of course, Mussolini was very good, for example, at abolishing inheritance taxes. And actually in Italy still today, we have one of the most regressive taxes on inheritance, which is basically in existence. Okay, but what's most important, I think here is where I would like to focus the last minutes of my presentation, is on the spending side. So austerity, right? Regressive taxation rather than just increases in taxes in general. And it's about, not just about, and this is very important connecting to the previous panel, I believe, it's not just about cutting state expenditure. If we focus on cutting state expenditure in general, we can go, I think we can be deceived in thinking that what we see today is not austerity capitalism, right? If you look at the aggregate, for example, in the United States, the state is spending a lot of money, but the places where the state is spending right now is not at all against the austerity logic, right? We're spending to enrich the usual few. We are spending on the war, military industrial complex. We're spending on bank bailouts. All the crises that this current capitalist states are confronting are crises that are being solved by an austerity logic by which the state is actually subsidizing the usual few. And this is also, of course, true, as it was reminded from the audience, of the green turn, right? And how the climate crisis right now is being resolved by fundamentally de-risking. The state is de-risking in favor of asset managers, as we very well know. So in this sense, I think this analysis of austerity as not looking at the aggregate, not looking at the economy as a given, but actually problematizing that capitalism is an economy that runs on specific social relations that constantly need protection, right? We cannot take them for granted. Those running the economic institutions at the Fed and at the Treasury do not take them for granted. This is why they're very worried about the fact that the labor market is too hot, because it fosters, with inflation, it fosters contestation of the basis. And this, I think, also allows us to think differently about the future of social democracy in problematizing what could an economic policy that works for social democracy look like if we understand that ultimately what the media tells us is Keynesian is very often not qualitatively distinct from austerity. And this is why I think critical tools can really help us look forward. This is not, I'm not saying this with a note of pessimism, but with a note of let's really realize how political our economic system is, and thus what are the economic policies that are viable for the economic system, and which ones are those instead that we really need to push for coming from the bottom that are actually policies that the capitalist state will not implement on its own unless there is serious struggle coming from below. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to start right away with a couple of disclaimers and an aphorism. Bear with me because that's how we do things in Greece, speeches. Disclaimer one, for those who might be perplexed with the similarity of my name to the guy organizing the conference, Yeroulanos is spelled with a Y, not a G. Yeroulanos with a Y is pronounced Yeroulanos all over the world, but Yeroulanos with a G is pronounced Geroulanos, Geroulanos, or Yeroulanos, depending on where you are. The only benefit of spelling Yeroulanos with a G in this case is to disguise any form of nepotism that might have led to my presence in this conference. Disclaimer number two. I'm not a scholar or an intellectual in any way. I'm a practitioner with experience in 2 different districts, Leicester West and Central Athens, 3 different parliaments, Greek, British, and the US, and the Municipal Council of Athens. Still, my views are local. I know Greek politics rather well, and Athens politics probably better, but I don't know if what I say here can in any way be projected to the rest of the world or Europe. And here for the aphorism, I never quite understand the use of the term social democrat. To me, it sounds a little bit like democratic republic. It's either verbose in countries that practice democracy or used as a euphemism in North Korea. In my view, there can never be a socialist who does not believe, preach, or practice democracy, at least not in my country, and I will explain why. But given these disclaimers and aphorisms, you're probably thinking this guy's in the wrong conference at the wrong time for the wrong reasons. And you might be right. So instead of speaking on a subject I don't know in a place I shouldn't be, I decided to talk about something completely different. I decided to talk about love and trust. For without love and trust, we cannot have a government of the people, by the people, for the people. And without a government of the people, by the people, for the people, we cannot have democracy, we cannot have socialism, and we can, I understand, not have social democracy. When my party, the Pan-Hellenic Socialist Movement, was formed in Greece, the founder, Andreas Papandreou, stated its mission in very clear terms. I think inspired by the Marxist rhetoric of the time, he simply wanted Greeks to be free. Free on three levels. Free of international influence. It was a time when the American assisted junta had fallen, but the influence of NATO and America was still very prominent in Greek politics. Free from social pressures, inequality was killing the middle and lower classes, and they had very limited bargaining power within government. And free to be who you aspire to be as a person, an individual or a citizen. Individual rights were squandered, and government worked only for its friends. In other words, Andreas Papandreou wanted every Greek person to be free on a national, on a social, and on an individual level. That was his triptych, his political triptych, in fact. Seen through this point of view, I believe that the birth of PASOK in Greece was an act of love and trust. Love of and trust in the Greek people. Fundamental to being free at the time was the freedom to get together, pursue and shape freedom together. In his time, unions became strong, local government became more democratic, farmers strengthened the collective bargaining, and small and medium-sized enterprises were enjoying the support of the government. The welfare state provided security for all of this. People had a voice, and the government listened. A bond was formed, a bond built on mutual trust, at least for a little while. Was the socialist rule in Greece all roses? By no means. At times, unions became an arm of the government. Some collectives became very corrupted. Local government strength was not coupled with accountability, leading to various abuses of power. In practice, PASOK's original version of freedom was deeply skewed by the control of power and money, much of which was provided through EU subsidies. Come to think of it, power and money is the usual cause for divorces, but we'll keep this idea for later. But during its rule, the country never went broke. Inequality was kept at bay. Transition from a farming society to a post-industrial one took place rather smoothly. Education and healthcare became more accessible and universal. We actually joined the EU and the Euro. That was not all. We hosted the best Olympics of all times, won the European Championship against Portugal in Portugal. Sorry, Katrina. And PASOK's time in power is associated to this day with a good life for the so-called common people. I might be making light of the Olympics and the European Championship, but in 2004 was the year where all Greek people felt we could do no wrong. It's a social state of mind I believe every politician should strive for. Since I'm talking about love and my daughter and nephew are somewhere in the audience, let me just say that is also a worthy goal for parenting. Fast forward to today, and we are far, far, far away from all of that. After the conservative-led bankruptcy of the country is fully dependent on EU funds and its directives. Inequality in income, wealth, and more importantly in Greece, access to power has grown exponentially. Individuals are expected to fend for themselves. Any form of collective claim is looked down upon with disdain and almost considered unpatriotic in many ways. We're back in the 70s. In a social study we ran back in 2008, a year before the conservatives fled the government, leaving the country bankrupt, Greek women and men already felt squandered under four overwhelming forces. We named them the pressure from below, from inside, from outside, and from above. The pressure from below, a new class of poverty, coupled with new waves of immigration. A pressure from inside, lack of rules and standards, competition rather than cooperation, breakdown of social networks, the feeling of being left on your own to fight both law in Greece and lawlessness. The pressure from outside, globalization, climate change, regional turmoil, the ever trigger happy Balkans. Even the EU, for the first time since Greece joining, was seen as a force of instability. But it's the fourth pressure that really broke the Greeks. The pressure from above, power. A small group of politicians, business people, and bankers, journalists, and some in the judiciary in cahoots deciding who makes it and who breaks. A ruling group so small and concentrated on their own interests that people disappeared from their sights, making all other forces at work even more unbearable. 50 years after the establishment of democracy in Greece, the re-establishment of democracy, 40 after PASOK took over, never have we seen so few wielding Greece so much power over so many. And then the crisis hit. Under the so-called Troika, the European Commission, the European Central Bank, and the IMF, central government got more powerful in order to collect taxes and pay debt. An ailing and very uncompetitive banking sector was now made responsible not only for all investments, state, European, and private, but also for all bankruptcies. Big business was further favored over SMEs as tax-paying and efficient, two characteristics that I can refute quite strongly. The power of unions was curtailed, leaving people to negotiate salaries and working conditions on their own. Local government, controlled recently by conservative mayors, still quite bureaucratic and unaccountable, was limited to collecting garbage and organizing music festivals. Worse yet, democracy is shrinking in Greece. Laws are passed with very little discussion. Criticism is silenced. The press is coerced in supporting the government, and the courts are underperforming. To add insult to injury, the prime minister was caught eavesdropping on his adversaries, on his own ministers, on journalists, and army officials. The vision of being free in Greece, free of fear, need, want, and pressure, has never been more distant in people's minds. And the left? Where's the left? The left is in the woods, split in factions, exhausted of infighting, and separated from the people it represents. It is aimlessly looking for purpose. Until it defines a purpose, even the sum of the parts of the factions that we're now all in do not suffice to beat the conservative government. Why? Well, first, PASOK paid an early and high price for being in power when the crisis hit. It carried the burden and paid for it dearly. It actually coined the term PASOKification. PASOKification to me is the definition of a political institution that has broken the bonds of trust with the people it represents. Its voters have gone, some have gone to the left, some have gone to the right, but the big majority of people who voted for PASOK are now at home. In the past, how many? Since 2010, so 12 years, we have lost 2 million people from the voting booths. Yeah. And PASOK is the one party that's missing in the equation. And Syriza. What is keeping Syriza from becoming the new PASOK? Well, apart from adopting the language of the right, profits over people, competition over cooperation, big business over SMEs, efficiency over collectivism, free trade over fair trade, big government over local government, the latest self-leaning government of Syriza also adopted the practices of the right. A government of the few, by the few, for the few, just different few. Why? Two reasons. One is DNA. To be fair, Syriza is not a socialist or a social democratic party. Its roots are communist and rather revolutionary. So a government of, by, and for the people was never its aim. Building trust people could participate freely in shaping their own future was never its strength. It is no coincidence that Syriza is heavily underrepresented in local government, in unions, and in farmers' collectives. Two, they are terrified, as we all are, of the growing waves of populism and neo-fascism. The growth of populism and neo-fascism has left the left so terrified that we're all running in the wrong direction. Instead of addressing the causes of distrust, we're grappling only with the symptoms. I can tell you that when I ran for mayor of Athens and I went down on the streets, the only other party, let's say, that I met was Golden Dawn. There was no one else in the streets. We here, government is not to be trusted, period. We respond, people are not to be trusted, period. Impasse, period. We have slowly, steadily, and surely shut ourselves in a room far, far away, leaving trumps to prey on fears. At this point in my speech, it might sound even more bizarre to mention again the word love, a word used in divorce courts only in the past tense. But make no mistake, we're in divorce proceedings. And someone has to be the adult in the room. Someone has to say, I'm sorry. Someone has to say, I trust you first. And someone has to say, despite of all that happened, I still love you. And I'm willing to do everything that I can to win you over. Because here's what is at stake. If the left does not reclaim its bond with people, inequality will rise, distrust will grow, populists and neo-fascists will capitalize on the fear, and the left will be left buttressing the right against the far right. That is exactly where we were right before the Second World War. It is actually terrifying in its simplicity. If we don't sow love, we shall reap war. Now, I have to remind myself that I am in a university, and even for an American university, this language might be a little too touchy-feely, maybe simplistic. So let me propose the same idea in a theorem that might make more, shall I say, scientific sense. We shall fail to address inequality and the concentration of capital if we fail to address the concentration of power. Or to put it in positive terms, the only way to redistribute wealth fairly is to redistribute power democratically. An idea gaining ground with PASOK these days. Because today we have an unsustainable lack of parity between the responsibility laid on an individual and the power they have to meet their responsibility. We have asked people to fend for themselves, but we have not provided them the tools to do so. We have fail to provide basic security against the four pressures I mentioned before that are actually pressuring the Greek household. And while we have unprecedented power to democratize money, energy, and knowledge, the three basic building blocks of modern creativity, we're keeping them in the markets and allocate them to oligarchies who distribute them still at a very high cost. Economically, as well as socially and politically, this model is constantly accelerating the end result, and the end result is a free fall over a cliff. Why? Because any disparity between power and responsibility leaves people terrified and exhausted. And that's where we are right now. So what does it mean to give people power? It means to trust people so deeply as to gradually involve more and more people in collective decision-making processes through highly independent and powerful institutions who can actually be free to shape our future, our individual, collective, and national futures. Not only the obvious stakeholders, but anyone who feels they have a vested interest in decisions that can change people's lives. Like, in my country at least, giving people real saying in national laws passed and local government plans to be implemented. Like giving citizens of a region the capacity to determine land use and environmental preservation. Like giving alumni decision-making power over state universities, or local authorities the capacity to choose from a pool of capable school principals the capacity to choose from a pool of capable teachers, and teachers the choice to teach what they think is best for their children. Excuse me. For some in the audience, such ideas are already implemented in your countries. But I know many in my country will be terrified of them. Just like you would be terrified with ideas that give more power to people in your societies. Why? Primarily because we feel that power to the people will lead to resistance, and resistance will lead to delays. Resistance against change and progress, resistance against investment, even resistance against things that we value as socialists and social democrats. This fear might be well-founded and true in some cases in the short run. But, and this is my final word, if we hold strong, if we hold steady, if we say I'm sorry, if we say I trust you first, and I will do everything in my power to win you back, people will respond. How do I know this? Because they always do. And that is why we believed in people in the first place. That is exactly why we established democracies in the first place. And that is exactly why, my friends, my Socialist Party was founded in the first place. So here are my 2 cents of wisdom from the streets of Athens, a sum of all I talked about today. Social Democrats, please love people again. Thank you.
A new book just came out in the US by Vincent Bevins, If We Burn. It's about this decade of mass protest, much of it stemming from anti-austerity protest in Athens being a prime example of these kind of politics. And the book is about the disconnect between these protest movements and politics at the level of the state. And so I wanted to ask you if you had an account of, how real is that disconnect? What accounts for it? And are we even still in this era of mass protests around these kinds of issues?
Yeah, thank you. That's an important question. So I think this is why we can say that austerity is an extremely intelligent framework for the capitalist state rather than a mistake, is that it really helps empower us in the very material sense of having to constantly have more money in our pockets in order to afford anything, right? In order to go to school, in order to get to get cured, in order to take public transportation. Anything we do is mediated by money, right? So this complete commodification of our lives means that we lose the mental and physical space to organize, and why ultimately I think the uprisings in Italy right now is devastating to see that Giorgia Meloni is in the footprints of Mussolini in the 1920s and 30s, much more than one thinks, is cutting all social expenditures, right? And the citizenship income, which was meager subsidies we gave to a population that is in poverty, and the poverty levels are rising, while numbers of billionaires rise as well. No one protested, right? There was very little mobilization in the street, very, very little. Actually, much less than even the people in government thought would be. So this is the first thing, is that most of these protests, I think, are defensive. When they even happen, they are defense, right? They're about claiming back what they've lost. And it's a constant defense mechanism, by which, to the point that in Italy right now, people are so devastated and so worried about just making a living that they have no time or energy to go in the streets. So this is the first thing, is how does one transform? And this, I think, maybe with your presentation is interesting. How do we transform these defense into offense? What is there what is something that one could actually try to do to? I think the first step would be to actually try to find spaces to gain to escape the compulsion from market dependence. And I think this is really the key, right? How do we escape the compulsion of market dependence? Market dependence that traps everyone, right? The lack of agency that was so obvious also in the previous panel as one of the big problems social democracy is facing right now, and how you can't really blame the party, or, of course, there's elements of hierarchical attitude within, but certainly there's this above, right? That is what is stressing us. So how do you gain back this agency with strategies that are indeed, I think, break away from the chains of market dependence is crucial. And of course, I think these are all things that the state, as it is understood right now, is going to operate rush, right? And so then, of course, the struggle that one has to face.
My quick answer was going to be, I don't know. And I will explain why, because I think we need to look into it a little bit more. But I think both the panel before and Clara here has, I think, voiced the elements that we need to put together to see where we are right now. The biggest mystery to me is why we're not on the streets. We're not. We really are not. Sure, we have pictures of, Paris burning, Athens burning sometimes, but it all dies down very quickly. There's no persistency, and the policies of neoliberalism just wait a little while, maybe, throw a few crumbs and then come right back at it, continuing their domination. Now, we need to understand the psychology of the people who are not in the streets. It used to be that you got an action and a reaction. People responded. It seems that they're exhausted. As Clara said, it seems that they're so busy to work and make ends meet that they're not in the street, if that makes sense. A law is being proposed right now for labor rights, for negotiating labor rights and stuff like that. And the minister the minister of labor came out and said this is a labor-friendly law because it makes it illegal for strikers block someone who wants to work. He actually said that. And we all sat there and we're like, oh. It is unbelievable how they will say, we will hear things like that And while the next day some university would explode and some turmoil would happen, here it just passes on. And the conservatives will vote this law in. We will say this is against labor and so forth, but it will happen and there will be no reaction. And if you ask how many times did unions block people from working when there was a strike the past 15, 20 years, the answer is zero. So passing a law for a problem that does not exist. We have given up in stopping people from working during strikes. It is mind-blowing, but we have to understand what is happening in society if we can speak to people again. And people are very needy of a voice, but they feel that nothing changes. And I believe, to link it to the last panel, which I thought was very interesting, the years of socialists adopting neoliberal policies as a mean of one day being able to help people has given people in the street the impression that you're all the same. Sure, you call yourself socialist, but you've been applying these policies yourself before. In fact, and I'll close with this, Mitsotakis, every time the opposition says something, just says, you started it. I'm just finishing it.
Can I add one point that I think is important, is how indeed austerity policies help actively construct this lack of agency. Is not only that we see clearly right now how the representative of the state are actually wielding quite of a one-sided class warfare against people mobilizing. For example, in Britain, there were many laws passed against mobilizations in the streets, in Italy, everywhere right now, or even just Biden forcefully stopping the railway strike. That's something that you would associate with corporativism. But we see, again, going back to history, how Mussolini's corporatism was very much in line with the need of preserving the basis of capitalism, which is the capital order, the social relations, and thus the state has no qualms of intervening to block. So this is important. But the other thing is that austerity is not just about the attitude of the state in the moment, it's also about how these economic priorities have fostered enormous constitutional reform that have really made the state into much more of an insular and non-democratic object, right? As you were pointing out in your presentation. But again, if you look at the EU, we passed, in order to participate in the EU, of course, for example, the balancing the budget is now in the Italian constitution and in many other states. The ECB is the most independent central bank in the world. Central bank independence is a fundamental element of austerity because it de-democratizes the space where economic decisions are made, so that those running the economic institutions that make the most important decisions on our lives. I was swimming the other day at the Harlem YMCA, and the lady next to me was telling me, I can't live because I can't afford taking on debt anymore, right? So the fact that she can't afford taking on debt anymore and that her relatives will lose their jobs because of increases in interest rates, so things that affect them directly, are being taken by institutions within the state apparatus, of course, that have no connection whatsoever with the base, right? So this is part of austerity, is also insulating the most important economic decisions of macroeconomic management away from the people. And this tells you then more why this unilateral class warfare is so obvious today. That people at the Fed are just saying it explicitly. It's not like, unfortunately, it's no conspiracy. They're just saying it explicitly. In order for our economy to work, unemployment rates needs to go up. And this is it. And this is the same line Keynesians and neoclassical economists have, because once capitalism goes encounters its limits, then either you try to deal with these limits or you have to think about something that goes beyond. And what that is not up to us to decide in this conference room, of course.
Right. We'll take questions two at a time and try to keep them relatively brief so we can hear from as many as possible. In the back row, James.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kurt Zem, a PhD candidate at the NSSR Economics Department. And also, disclaimer, Clara is my chair of my PhD. You didn't know I was coming today. But I actually wanted to talk about kind of the idea of weaponizing austerity, and then also specifically in your experience, Pavlos, is I'm trying to become the water guy of economics. And one thing I've been reading about,
The what guy?
the water guy.
Okay.
And then, so in Greece, there's been a big push to privatize water. And so one, if you have any experiences of just those debates or how that's been working at the political realm, but then also to Clara more specifically is the ability for the austerity logic to constantly shift. So if you throw a new element into it, it can be like, oh, we didn't like natural resources, right? Wasn't a focus in the 20s and 30s for the Italian and London cases, but now it is a major concern of both the Fed and governments. And specifically, right, Brian Deese, who's one of Biden's main advisors, now pushing for, well, we got to privatize water and create water futures markets because that's, and not so much in like, I want to control the water, but it's the mentality of the system. And I was just wondering if you also see that, well, we've talked about it before, but the concept of using privatization of natural resources as another form within the austerity trinity.
I saw James.
Yeah, so one of the things that strikes me about austerity politics is that it's frustratingly often quite popular, and, you know, receives democratic sanction. And this, I think, is because it protects small property as well as large, and people who hold small properties aren't necessarily that interested in inequality per se. They're interested in protecting what they have. And, you know, it strikes me that one of the insights that left populism has actually offered, and I think Ireland with, you know, the success of Sinn Féin is a very good example of this, but also Labour under Corbyn and its appeal to home ownership is somehow combining the defense of small property with a broader attack on inequality. So I wonder, you know, inflation is itself unpopular. So people who are promising to stop it are bound to win plaudits. So whatever the kind of economic sense of it, sort of how is it possible to defuse that vicious cycle? And I think, you know, Greece, there's obviously things to talk about there in relation to that problem too.
Go ahead.
To the second question first. This is, I think, the task that I feel like myself and others in our positions as academics can really be helpful, is to really try to find ways to make popular to people how our economy actually functions, right? And how actually the private owners are not protected by austerity at all, because austerity does not protect the normal middle-class families. It really doesn't, right? So here, indeed, this is why it's really important to pierce the veil of the economic ideology that still dominates today, and have people realize that austerity is all about actually increasing the precariousness of all people who make an income with a wage, right, and a salary. And it's unfortunately, the outcome is this society which is so distant, and the common people have no clue how the wealthy actually live, or how the real world, who actually guides the economic machine, is actually living or operating, right? So the complete disconnect of the common people from how the economy actually runs, so that they can even buy into the idea that curbing inflation and balancing the budget is in their interest, is, I think, a really, really big task that we can take on. Because, of course, inflation is a problem, but it's especially a problem for the ruling class, especially if workers get mobilized. And you can find, of course, many other ways to deal with inflation, which is not increasing interest rates. And this is something that is not clear to people because it's not told. We still think that our economy runs for the good of everyone. There's no such thing as the common good in a capitalist economy. This is something I think that those who want to push social democracy forward need to realize, is that the very logic, the functioning, and this is, I think, why our PhD at the New School is useful, is that in the tradition based in the classical political tradition that someone like Anwar Sheikh or Duncan Foley, my colleagues, try to push is let's really stop living in la land and understand how capitalism works. There's no policies that are good for everyone. It's always a trade-off, and there's always winners and losers. And the point is, I think this is something that the people should know in order to actually stand for anti-austerity. And to me, anti-austerity has to be anti-capitalist. That, of course, is kind of obvious from my words. And about water, I think water is a great place where you can get people to understand how much, for example, those who think of themselves as middle class are actually in the same boat as others who are much more, let's say, in worse conditions, is that if you privatize water management, clearly, as we know, and again, there's no moralism here, the private businesses who run water management are there to make a profit. And as we know, profit is made, especially in these cases, out of increasing the tariffs for the use of water and diminishing the cost for the maintenance of a good water system. And this is something that would be very easy to explain to people and get people mobilized. But then there's counter forces. We won a referendum in Italy in 2011 against the privatization of water management, and no one thought it was going to be a success. People turned out to vote, and the whole mainstream media did not cover the issue at all. So it was all done really through channels that were on the street. People were on the street getting signatures, getting people mobilized. And there was a complete, really, censorship from the above. And that was great. But then, Draghi passed a measure without anyone knowing just last summer before leaving our government, basically telling the cities that they had to privatize water again unless they proved to be more efficient. So you see how easy it is. So you can mobilize people, but not thinking that you won an easy win just because the referendum went well, because the struggle continues. And the defense is there through austerity.
As far as the popularity of austerity, I think Clara said it all, and I'm not going to add to that. I totally agree. I totally agree with her. In terms of water privatization, if you are interested in the subject, I would recommend I get you some more information as to what is happening in Greece, because actually the High Court reversed the government's effort to privatize water, which was a very interesting move. And we're waiting for, in Greece, it takes a long time for, I don't know if I can translate the term, but once a court makes a decision, then it takes forever to cleanly write. This is actually a verb, to cleanly write the decision. So we're waiting for the decision and the thinking behind it. But let me just say one thing about my experience with privatization, something that PASOK did a lot of. We did privatization for the wrong reasons. While we were saying that privatization would increase service to people, we basically privatized in order to fill our coffers with money, to spend more, to have more for other services. So in Greece, there was a motivation to sell things at a very high price. Now, in order to sell things at a very high price, what the government did is it passed laws that essentially protected monopolies or oligarchies. So we privatized the national airport, and one of the terms was that there could be no other airport in the Athens region for I don't know how many decades. And as a result, the airport of Athens was the second most expensive airport in Europe. And as a result, we never got low-cost carriers in Greece until about 5 years ago, thereby keeping back income which could have come to Greece. And this is usually income that goes more, in smaller businesses. Now, but we keep doing that. We've monopolized, we've privatized monopolies. And even capitalists will agree that if there's one thing worse than a public monopoly, it's a private monopoly. It's something we can at least agree on that, but we keep doing it again and again because we need the money to bring into for our budget. And now people are very confused because they're like, what are you doing this for exactly? What good could come from the privatization of water? And I think it's unfortunate, but the first thing that was privatized in Greece was telecommunication. And that was a successful privatization. Costs came down like crazy and services went up. And we're still under the impression that is what privatization does. It doesn't in all cases. And we have to be careful how we use the term privatization and what we do it for.
Alex?
Hi. So I guess I had a question about social democracy that operates at the international level, because I think both of your presentations raise those issues from outside. And the institutions within which social democracy is often embedded that end up not figuring within social democratic programs, but often in cases are determinant of what social democrats do in office. So I'll ask my question to Pavlos first, because I was most struck by your presentation of PASOK's time in office in this respect and its contrast with Syriza, which it wasn't exactly the thing I expected you to say, because for me, one of the lines of continuity between PASOK and Syriza, although of course there are sociological differences between them and their base, is not so much that Syriza comes out of a communist or far left tradition, but that in the moment of decision, it gave in to the Troika, for example, and defied even the expressed will of Greek voters in accepting the austerity package that resulted in, by one measure, the largest drop in GDP, a larger drop in GDP and standards of living that took place in the US during the Great Depression. So the issue for me in Syriza's sort of disgrace and fallen vote share and so on is that it took as given at the last moment the structures of the EU within which PASOK also operated just at a moment when the subsidies from the EU were beneficial to it. Of course, the result, though, was this moment of real crisis in the Greek economy. And then I think also within that, we have to talk about NATO and the fact that the Papandreou's father and son were not only educated at American institutions, but were deeply committed to this alliance that has all sorts of implications for Greece and what social democrats might be able to do, sort of independent line that they might be able to pursue. That's evident in Cyprus and in other parts of Greece's international relations. For Clara, your primary example is Italy and Britain in the 1920s and 30s. And there too, there's a geopolitical dimension to Britain's support for Mussolini's campaign for austerity. Britain wanted, and also it's looking the other way in the case of Italy's attack on Abyssinia and so on. There's this sort of geopolitics that determines often the kinds of alliances that states form. I wonder if, thinking about the present, because you're talking more about that, okay, austerity is often mobilized as a kind of response to international markets and to international pressures from investors or from outside. Is that key to understanding what Meloni is doing in Italy, or in some other cases where you see austerity being pushed that's operative at that kind of global level, whether that's real or imagined ideologically?
Would you like to?
Hi, Estelle. I wanted to ask you to explore a little bit, some of which was just raised, on the question of how you define economic austerity and what should be done instead. Because what I was thinking is, let's agree with you, there's been tremendous inequality created in assets. There's been poor treatment of labor. So I'm not addressing, and just the symptoms, I'm not addressing those issues of social inequality, which indeed need to be addressed. And I think most of this audience and social democracy would agree with. But economically, I think it's a bit more complicated to make sure that the policies go the right way. You look back at one of the examples you raised, Mussolini. You have, prior to Hitler, as you know, left in power, runaway inflation, which hurt leftist policies for umpteen years, memory of which still used here in discussions, and was followed by fascism. Even in France, on a more modest scale, you had Léon Blum, who did so many good things socially, but where the economy completely went off the track and gave credence to the rightist parties for the wrong reasons, perhaps, and then to do obviously wrong policies by our judgment. In very recent periods, you've had people like Professor Stiglitz, whom I imagine you would like, happens to be a friend, but who was advocating some version of what's called modern monetary theory, which basically was arguing that there's no limit for a country like the United States to expand its social programs with the admitted needs we have, unless inflation comes. And inflation did come. You can argue whether it came from outside sources. You have had the greatest deficit currently for a growing economy that we've had. And the cumulative deficits, worse under the Republicans than the Democrats, have eroded. Since the Fed was created, the dollar has lost 98, 99% of its purchasing power. So the question that I'm really asking is, austerity seems like an obvious thing that one is against, but how economically in this period, and where in fact all the social programs have grown much faster than GDP, Medicaid, Social Security, unemployment benefits when they've been needed, all of which are good, I understand. But how in that context do you define austerity and what should instead be done in the economic context, not just the social quality?
Okay, thank you. That is an enormous and crucial question, which would be a lot to say on. Perhaps, I think you really raised the key issue here, inflation, really the elephant in the room, which shows once more how we cannot, and this is really, I think, why we need a complete switch of lens on the world. We cannot understand economic issues as separable from political issues. And this is really, really important. Like, we're trained as economists to think, okay, here's an economic problem, and here's all the rest, right? And then here's the problem of inequality, and here's the problem of whatever, but as very separate questions. But unfortunately, I think it's really there with inflation that you see the limits of our economic system, the political and economic limits all at once of our economic system, right? Because indeed, inflation is a moment in which all Keynesians agree with their austerity partners, right? Ultimately, Keynesians become austere. And this is because the macroeconomic management of capitalism tells you that if the economy is running hot, in order to bring prices down, you gotta go counter-cyclical and implement austerity measures through monetary austerity, increases in interest rates, through cuts, especially in the social services, which are the ones that then, of course, foster a decrease in consumers' demand. So I think this is really, really key, is that right now our role, I think, as economists and as social sciences is to thematize inflation as the issue that really shows the weaknesses of the way in which we have collectively decided to organize production distribution in our society. And capitalism is not that old as an economic system, and other economic systems have existed, and I think other economic systems could come. And this does not require a bloody revolution, in my view. It requires rethinking the fact that goods are mediated through the market, right? We live in an anarchic market. This is how capitalism works, in which no one there's no conscious recognition of what is being produced in order to satisfy needs. It is all mediated by the profit motive and the need to be able to sell in the market instead of others, right? And no producer is actually cooperating, right? That's the whole difference between a market and a planning economy, is that in a market economy, we're all in competition to sell the goods before others at cheaper prices. So this is all to say that indeed, once we have inflation as a problem, we see how capitalism really only works by austerity. And of course, you could say we can try to, if there were political will to confront inflation via, for example, price capping, or that would already not be really the type of capitalism we would be in, right? It would require a shift that is both economic and political, of thinking of another way to organize society. But if we want to maintain capitalism as it is, we got to go austerity. That's why austerity is not stupid. Austerity works in order to stabilize the economy, because our economy does require a certain degree of unemployment. And this was true also during the golden age, by the way. Certain degree of unemployment is necessary for there to be enough people to employ at low wages that are competitive enough in order to export. These are real problems. You're right to say these are necessities. They're real problems. But I would like to stress, not real problems in the absolute universal history of humanity. They're real problems in a capitalist economic system. And thus we need to decide whether we want to preserve it and thus enforce pain on the usual suspects, or we want to try to be imaginative and think about something else, which again, I don't think requires a bloody revolution. It requires actually thinking differently, maybe more local, as you were pointing out, Pavlos. And so very quickly on Alex's question, I think you raise a really, really crucial point. It's another way in which Meloni is hiding her austerity agenda. And the reason why Meloni is so ultimately, I mean, Meloni is loved right now by the Biden administration, she's considered a respectable government because she has as her Minister of Treasury, Giorgetti, who was also working with Draghi beforehand. He comes out of Bocconi University, is trained in classical economics, and is doing the prudent measures that are required in order for Italy to not downgrade its credit rating, right? Again, rational. And Meloni uses this idea by which it's the outside world she's against to hide the internal class struggle that is going on, and to hide the fact that the government is indeed, again, punishing the working people. So I think what's interesting is that the debate right now in Italy is all about, Meloni is trying to tell the ECB that we want to rethink now the fiscal pact, right? We need to rethink the fiscal pact. And then the whole discussion in Italy is portrayed in nationalistic terms. And I think the ideology of national unity is, of course, very strong to actually hide what is actually going on, which is the fact that not all Italians lose with austerity. The rich Italians win with austerity, right? Because actually, if you increase, for example, the Italian private equity firms' management of the economy, the billionaires do grow in Italy. So again, in Italy, not everyone is losing from austerity, the majority is losing. But at the same time, the idea that we're all in it together against the bad Europe is something that is hiding, I think, a much more important struggle that we have to actually expose.
Alex, I think the basic difference between Syriza and PASOK is Syriza never expected to govern. Syriza never expected to govern. I don't think they even wanted to govern. It was the collapse of PASOK that suddenly catapulted a small group of intellectuals and well-meaning people to a position that they had never thought that they would ever get to. Syriza has a long past. And never in that long past did it ever really make an effort to govern. I think what happened, and this explains the referendum, is that the whole idea of governing was to them very, very foreign in their mentality. And that's the only way you can explain how a party decides on a referendum I mean, the right tried it in England, very different results. But decide on a referendum and then reverse the decision of the people. It's like, it's stupid enough to go into a referendum in the first place if you are trying to govern a country. And I'm not saying that referendums are not useful, but the first referendum you're going to do in Greece cannot be, are we or are we not part of the European Union? Let's start small, regional. Let's have people decide first. Let's start at least working the problem. And in order to absolve itself from responsibility, it decides on the referendum and then proceeds to reverse the decision of the people. It's crazy. It's dangerous. It's outright dangerous. As far as international institutions, I'm at a loss. I don't know how to explain. I've studied economics, not like many of you have, but enough to be able to read Stiglitz. I don't know what we're doing. I really don't. I don't understand what we're doing. And let me explain why. The guy who actually opened my eyes on this was a janitor in Wyoming. I had gone to Wyoming right before the elections where Trump won. And I was left alone at the hotel and we were having drinks with the janitor and the barwoman, the three of us. And I asked them what they were going to vote for. And the barwoman said, look, I'm going to vote Democrat because Trump simply offends me as a woman, which I thought was sort of like voicing what we thought back in Europe. And then the janitor said, I'm going to vote for Trump. I said, why? I said, look, I have 3 jobs and I like having 3 jobs. My problem is that if I lose even one of them, it's over for me. It's not like I'm doing 2 jobs and the 3rd job is collecting money for my children or for my future or for my retirement. I have to work 3 jobs constantly in order not to fall through the cracks. So I don't care who Trump is. I just want all of you out, which I thought was very interesting. And that started, I got fascinated with Trump, to tell the truth. How could he speak to the people we were supposed to speak to? Because he does. And what he says is not what is broadcast in the news. I mean, we get all offended about things that he says, which are his diamonds of wisdom and stupidity and stuff like that. But when he speaks to the people, he speaks a very direct language and a very interesting. So here's my problem with international institutions. I went to my socialist party one day and I said, we should rethink tariffs. And people just gasped. He said, how can you say the word? Tariffs are bad. Like, I'm not saying tariffs, don't say that, I'm not going to import bananas from, Brazil because we're producing bananas in Crete. I'm not talking about these taxes, these tariffs. But why? Do we have a situation in the European Union? I'm a fish farmer, by the way. That's my trade. I raise fish. And the European Parliament says, I'm not allowed to give hormones to fish, which is fine by me. But the European Parliament does not check Turkish fish for hormones. Like, wait a second. Hormones, by the way, increase growth by about 15%. So now I'm not competing with Turkish salaries, I'm competing with Turkish hormones. Now, 15% is big in fish production. I'm like, all right, you don't want to protect European business people, fine. You don't want to protect European workers, stupid, but okay. You're not even protecting European consumers. Who are you doing this for? It's the first time that we put a tax on imports that pollute the environment. It's insane. We cannot pollute the environment in Europe. We cannot pollute the air in Europe. But we bring in goods that are polluting the same air in China. Why? It doesn't make sense. And for me to go down to the streets of Athens and explain this, I look like an idiot. I really do. So how can I defend these institutions that are doing things that are completely counterintuitive down in the street? We're so obsessed about markets. Markets have nothing to do with people.
Exactly.
Nothing.
Exactly.
Nothing. It's insane. I mean, the only thing they guarantee is the parity between the dollar and the euro in a little bit of an efficient way. And let's not make a mistake. Free markets were made in order to do one thing: determine market prices. We have turned these markets into gods. And we explain it to people as if they're gods. And people don't understand. Like, guys, you don't understand, I'm starving. What are you talking about, austerity? Do something, at least for us who are having trouble to survive. You used to be able to do that. What happened since then? You did things for us. Now you just put your hands up and you say, oh, I can't do it because the markets are going to open tomorrow and something bad is going to happen. That is our narrative. And our narrative is so disconnected that it's no surprise that we're so far behind the conservatives who are galloping in their thinking and in their explaining things to people. And they're saying, yeah, austerity is good for you. No one is saying, really for the first time we have increases in salaries of the poor. Is there a good inflation and a bad inflation? We need answers to these things. Otherwise, we won't be able to go down the street. We're going to be beaten out of it.
If I can add, it's very interesting because how it's so intelligent how the dominant narrative is framed, to the point that even in this room, the idea that inflation is bad, just like this, is something that we all kind of have accepted. And again, I would like to point out how inflation is more dangerous for some classes in society rather than for others. And in a way, if inflation, as Keynes himself understood, is going to actually, strike at the whole basis of capitalism, this means that people could actually get mobilized and ask for increases in wages and try to fight for their future, while we have this sense by which inflation is bad, because inflation indeed is bad for creditors, right? Primarily, inflation is bad for creditors. It's not bad for the people if the people are actually, of course, it's bad because they're paying more at the supermarket, but this means that they could start thinking, well, maybe we're not living in the best and only possible world if food is so expensive and if my wages are so low. Maybe we should get together and think about organizing collectively for at least a wage increase. And this is scary, again, for the people at the top. And this is why the primary objective of anyone, and if you listen to the economic news right now, all you talk about is defeating inflation. Again, why do we talk about only this? Well, because it's something that is particularly threatening, both from an economic point of view and a deeply political point of view, to those that are running our economy. And so we need to break away from this narrative and say, no, we can't just internalize the narrative of those who still hold on to the hegemony. If we want a counter-hegemonic narrative, we need to start explaining to people that there's no bad or good as a whole in a capitalist economy, once more, I think.
Just to add, you just remind me on your comment about inheritance tax, right? My kid will probably kill me for this, but shouldn't inheritance tax be something we both agree should go up? It's something that socialists always said that we need, to start more or less fairly. We shouldn't have privileges for the rich. All right, so an inheritance tax would be good for us, and that's, I think, obvious. But aren't the capitalists the ones who are saying that every individual performs their best when you don't have prolonged periods of some people being, comfortable and knowing that no matter what happens, they will live rich? Well, now we have a class of people who live rich for the next 20 generations.
The richest man in Italy is the son of Ferrero and did absolutely nothing. And he's the richest man in Italy. And he's the son of Ferrero, industrialist, but that's, his maintaining, of course.
Isn't inheritance tax something we can agree on? Apparently not. The Prime Minister of Greece dropped inheritance tax in an unprecedented manner. Let me just say that we, as a family, transferred all our assets, all my mother's assets to us and all our assets to our kids. It was that good a deal.
Yeah.
It's insane. I think we can agree on that.
If we can add on a positive note, I think this is why there's a lot of grounds to actually get people mobilized, because these things are so overtly absurd, yeah.
All right, well, I think we have time for two more. I saw it in the back, in the orange shirt and then stuff.
I wasn't the first one, so I don't know.
Okay, who was it?
I mean, I can, but I think there were other people before me, so I think I should be fair.
Very generous.
Can I just, so I'm Jonah Birch. It seems to me that it would be useful in some ways to see some of the differences between the US and European context since 2008, both in terms of the left, and as far as I could tell, in most parts of Europe, the left, it's been a slow motion catastrophe since 2008. I don't think that's true in the US. I don't think there's been anything like the growth of the US left since 2016 that you've seen in Europe. But the other thing is around austerity. I mean, just to say, it's shocking to me, but we have had, 18 months of under 4% unemployment in the US? And the Biden administration, again, shockingly, has appointed Labor Department officials and a NLRB that's more left-wing than any since the 1930s. And even a lot of the economic advisors are, they come out of like EPI, Roosevelt Institute. Some of them are connected. These are not people who are just Clinton-style neoliberals from the 1930s. And as a result, you are seeing offensive strikes. I mean, the UAW strike is an offensive strike, right? So it seems to me that there's a different political situation here for a whole variety of reasons.
I have a question on a completely different matter, which is I'm wondering about, I keep trying to work through the relationship between this narrative and the sort of dominance of the narrative and the hopelessness, right, of the politics and mobilization that you and other people have been talking about, and the sort of architecture, the monetary architecture in particular that Clara is talking about. And so specifically, I'm interested in your thoughts on, you were talking about the sort of the 1920s, the post World War I period, and that's the gold standard period. And gold is a pretty tangible thing. And there was, at least in the US, for the last, I don't know, half a century before that, a very active politics around the form that money should take and who was benefited by gold versus silver versus greenbacks versus, right? And one of the things that I have been trying to wrap my head around is you have this new world that Clara, you made reference to, the world of the central banks and the ECB and this, this global architecture linked to the troika, that protects this institutional form of money that has no reality to it, right? That is just it's a purely abstract form of money now. And I guess I'm wondering about your thoughts on whether there's a relationship between that architecture and this sort of difficulty of mobilizing a politics around austerity and recognizing that inflation is political, and this sort of difficulty of mobilizing people and helping people sort of wrap their minds around what's at stake.
No, I think this is all Clara.
Okay, this is an important, I think, difficult question. I mean, it raises a whole bunch of issues about what is money in the first place, right? And there's lots of theories on this. And a theory that is grounded in a Marxian analysis would tell you that it doesn't really matter what expression money takes, can be gold or can be whatever. The point is that money is indeed emerges out of the market, out of independent private producers exchanging goods and how society is organized, right? So in that sense, clearly it doesn't make a qualitative difference whether it's we are anchored to gold or not in this. But I do agree with you that it does, I guess, and this is the first time I really think about it, I think it does promote a sense of distance between the people and the object called the economy, right? Which is, I think, what helps de-democratize and ultimately naturalize our system. And that was also what the gold standard was doing, right? It made it took away the political element of deciding on deflation, right? You had to deflate because otherwise the money was going to move out of your country. So the fact that the gold standard basically made austerity a technical necessity was very important politically as a strategy to foster this disenfranchisement of people, especially in a moment, by the way, during the war, the gold standard had been put out, and indeed people were demanding a greater say. There was, for example, in the 1920s, the idea of nationalizing the Bank of England. And that's exactly when the people that I study in my work said, well, no, the central bank should be there to never have to explain, never regret, never apologize. And these are actually the terms that you can only have prudent, inflationary averse policies if the central bank is made independent. So this goes all the way back. So the gold standard was already connected to the independent central banks, and that was very crucial. Now how there's independent central bank without the gold standard, I think helps the cause of disassociating, if that makes sense. Very quickly, absolutely. I really agree. And that's, though, I think, speaks in favor of the case I want to make for why austerity is so intelligent in preserving class relations, is that it is indeed the United States that is leading the economic and fiscal policies of the world, and it's doing it in a moment in which, in a way, they're reacting to this greater mobilization. And of course, like Biden can put whoever in office, but the whole point is that Biden will never go against what the Fed is deciding to do and has very little say once they say, listen, we're going to right now on the 30th of September, we're again risking a shutdown. And in the last year, 22-23, I was just listening to Marketplace this morning, the federal grants for children has decreased 16% in just 1 year. So this is, even if we have this talk about big government expenditures, what's happening in the background is that there's constant defunding of public transport. We know that the fees of the subway went up, that there's constant defunding of all social programs, and this is happening notwithstanding who is in government, right? But at the same time, it is the case that I think they are reacting to mobilized labor here. But in it, and the paradox is that in Europe, where there is definitely not this risk for the capital order because people are not mobilizing or strongly, we're still getting the effects of austerity policy because the ECB has no choice but to continue raising interest rates, right? So it's even more tragic in Italy, and I think this is a very important difference to mind, yes.
Let me just put one thing on the table. I hope it's the last thing so I can run out before people kill me. I believe in what I've called patriotic economy. I don't believe that governments are very good in creating businesses. I think that governments are not bad at all in creating markets. Let me give you an example. How many of you have been in Greece? And how many have gone beyond Santorini and Athens? All right, great. Great. So you know that we live in a gorgeously beautiful country. 10 years ago, 12 years ago, I was Minister of Tourism, and our goal was to increase people coming to Greece because our hotels were empty. That goal was achieved and was continued until now, to the point where prices are much higher than services provided. Hotels are over capacity, services cannot follow, and many of the public services cannot meet the demand of new people coming in. Now, never did anyone think of the idea of helping other regions of Greece, some of which are gorgeous, like Epirus, which used to be for centuries one of the richest places in Greece until we centralized government. The Peloponnese, central Greece, the region of central Greece, to helping them bring in tourism. We're not talking about, breaking our minds to start creating chips or something in Greece. We're talking about something we do well in one region, just moving it a little bit, helping people move it somewhere else. So you can still come to Greece, but have a different experience, maybe richer experience, maybe come a second or third time. Certainly not sort of like everybody go to Santorini. Now, this doesn't take much because we have the knowledge. Same thing with something else. 6 products of Greek agriculture have now reached, following Spain, Portugal, and Italy, some of the best restaurants and best supermarkets in the world. Olives and oil, yogurt and feta cheese and fish and wine. The markets are not what they used to be for us. The idea of going to America was like big, like even 20 years ago. But now it's simple. We know how to do it. The government has never called us to say, guys, can you help another 10 products make it there? Why not start thinking of the government as an agent who can actually create markets, either markets abroad for products that are produced in our countries, or services within our expand services in our country. And again, I'm not talking about changing the economy completely, but at least helping Greeks create wealth. We don't even think about it in those terms, not even the socialists. And I think that's sad. The idea that that the market will solve problems is something that we have so much swallowed without chewing that we repeat it again and again without thinking what it means. The markets don't fix problems. In fact, for the past years that we've been letting markets do what they like, they've created more problems than they fixed. So I believe in, and here's to connect it with the question of EU-US difference. If you note, by the way, Trump lost because of COVID, not because of Biden or center-left politics. The growth in the labor market started during his time, if I'm not mistaken. And his narrative was very oriented towards American business first. The problem is he meant my friend's American business, not markets. And that is the space that we're leaving open by not pursuing these policies. Because I know that the same market, the same idea of creating a market or protecting your market from competition that is producing things in a way that you would never produce in your country is something that we have completely left open to Republicans and to the Tories and to New Democracy to move in and play the role of the one that's a friend of the people. And that's what Trump did quite effectively. And I wouldn't like to see the same thing happen in Greece.
I think that is all the time we have.
Oh,
Sorry.
that's not-
Yeah.
Thank
But
you.
thank you everyone here for all the great questions. Thank you to our